Easy.
Recording has started.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Love to see everyone. So apologies for the slight technical issues there, inevitable technical issues. Okay, so I'll just start talking and take you through. I've kind of sort of framing this talk around my work, my paintings that specifically kind of deal with architecture, space, surface and depth, and kind of create conversations or dialogues or ask questions between the idea of surface painting as object and, sorry, there are pop-ups coming up, and painting as a sort of illusory space or fictional space. So I've sort of chosen things specifically that look at that. So there's a bit of a chronology to it. So we'll start with the first work, which is this one, C, which is a really sort of going back in time. It's quite an early work. It's from about 1998 or something like that, and it's about 6 foot by 6 foot, and it was kind of an early exploration into at the time I was thinking about regeneration and the kind of transformation of public spaces and what that kind of looks like, and thinking of regeneration as a kind of way of controlling landscape and making it say something in a sense. So I was getting into this idea of fragmentation of the image, really, and almost like cutting it up and jigsawing it back together to be slightly analogous to the way that I was thinking that these kinds of new public spaces are sort of weirdly put together, but also just this like liberation of actually fragmentation of the image as well, hugely, and combining it with a kind of sort of idealised kitsch that I was getting from things like holiday brochures. It's quite a long time ago, they don't really exist anymore, but and how the image was often composed in a particular way to create a sort of sense of desire. So and I was using this material fragmentation as well to kind of constantly create illusion and space and then deny that. So things like spray paint for the sky to create this idea of a perfect sky somehow, and then things like emulsion and gloss mixed together to create like an awkward sort of gloopiness for the kind of paving. But this kind of painting at the time really opened up painting so much for me, and sort of forevermore really, and these ideas of like fragmentation, juxtaposition, pastiche, and surface and depth being things that concern me all the way through. That just sort of sets the scene a bit. And then a bit later I got interested in let's move that, can you see? Yeah. Power, and how sort of power is manifest in architecture and space. And I was looking at corporate space and sort of interiors of corporate space, but sort of real and imagined, to explore this, and wanted the surface to become part of the language. The surface to like question the image and sort of contradict the image, but create a dialogue between the image and surface. So I was using what I sort of saw as like fragments from the real world, but kind of like not very good, like kind of slightly throwaway fragments or degraded things. So things like polystyrene and bits of old perspex, and this one that you can see now is a piece of reinforced glass that I've found. Hopefully you can kind of see that there's that kind of metallic metal grid running through it, and you know, reinforced glass being quite municipal and contradicting with the sort of luxurious image on there, which is of a lift shaft done in black hammerite paint, so it's really impenetrable, it's really reflective, and then the white grid, which is a motif that runs through all my work, actually tracing back to this, which I've only kind of realised recently, interacting quite delicately with the embedded grid in the glass, and the spray paint for that being frosted glass spray paint, which, I mean, it doesn't look anything like frosted glass, and I'm really kind of interested in, and still am in, materials that have a sort of mimesis in them that pretend to be something else, like stone effect spray paint and crackle glaze and things like that. They sort of have this artificiality. You can see that's like leaning on a plinth there against the wall. But really awkward to deal with hanging. The next one in this kind of series, I might have to zoom out a bit, is members only. It's called, and on a piece of polystyrene that's sort of arm span kind of size. Again, looking at this contradiction between the discarded quality of the material, the polystyrene, which is a throwaway packaging material, obviously, and hard to work with as well, hard to manipulate, with this kind of vignette, this impossible vignette of a kind of corporate private swimming pool. And what I kind of liked about this as well, doing this, was leaving most of the polystyrene visible and bare with all its kind of dents and knocks and things like that. And another one in this series, which is silver. It's hard to see, it looks greenish really, but it's silver spray paint on orange perspex with a kind of oil painted little luxurious cushion in there. This was a really sort of exploration of a sort of detail, meticulousness or repetition, you know, and a kind of exaggerated corporate bathroom or something, quite masculine, obviously. And at the time, I was influenced, and still am, by reading things like Friedrich Jameson's ideas about postmodern space being very disorientating, and also the sociologist Richard Sennett, who talks about like things like glass and reflection being used in corporate architecture as a suggestion of transparency, but actually it does the opposite, and it's actually very disorientating and for the body in space. So from the kind of real use of that surface and sort of tricky surfaces as part of that language, I kind of got interested a bit later in sort of idealised architectural images and visualizations. So what I mean by that is the kinds of images that are produced in the field of architecture and other things to describe an environment that isn't built yet. So you know, this fabulous building and this lovely park that we're going to have around here, and those images are put together is quite specific, and they have lots of sort of tropes in there and ways of creating this sense of perfection. So I was kind of taking those, exaggerating them, layering them onto different sheets of acetate. So it's all painted, but then obviously it's worked kind of as a collage afterwards. This one being called Eco Hotel. And so the main sort of subject of that being this enormous, ludicrous kind of tower, that the question of that being an ecological building is quite interesting anyway, about how can you build something like that to be ecological, but then juxtaposing it with these different kinds of architecture, vernacular sheds and futuristic pods and repeated tower blocks. And so you can kind of see, I mean, can you see? You can kind of see a kind of almost like a fetishized detail in there, which I was using to create a sense of perfection, or sort of, but also impossibility. You know, you never see anything like ridiculous kind of detail. And the kind of important thing about this series, in terms of this thing about surface, really, is that these were all, like I say, on acetate or clear perspex, painted in reverse, so that the surface became this slippery plastic sheen behind which everything else was kind of trapped. So it was almost like analogous to a screen in a way. It's quite intangible, so sort of almost the opposite way of thinking about a surface. I've got a few of these which I'll just think through. And this one, I've included this one because it was bringing in another element of, I wanted to bring in the idea of disaster in there, or like the end of something. And the tower block is the falling down tower blocks are actually an estate, I've forgotten the name now, but in St Louis, that was really famously demolished, and kind of encapsulated or embodied the debate about whether architecture is responsible for like social demise and decay, or whether it's other factors like economic or social factors that are. And obviously it's an ongoing debate that really interests me, but so I wanted to kind of combine that with a sort of kitsch or lurid sky and bridge, and then this ball thing, which is actually an artist's impression of an idea for a monument to build for the millennium, which was never built, and it's so sort of whimsical and sort of innocent in a way. I wanted to create that combination to ask questions about these things, not to sort of answer questions, but to ask questions and create dialogues between different kinds of architectural ideologies. Quickly do this one, which is a bit bigger. Some of them quite small of this series, but and this one looking at a sort of a romantic representation of a particular landscape using Brancusi's massive, famous sculpture, which I think is sort of fantastic and ridiculous. And someone told me recently was supposed to be painted gold, which is even better. And put together with this quite kind of kitsch framing of flowers, and then this sort of very technological building that wasn't sort of built. The thing about this is that you can see, hopefully, is the roughness of the edges. So to again kind of contradict the idea of something perfect and something sort of plasticky and sheen-like, with these really kind of cut rough edges that just hang, and they would just hang on bulldog clips from the walls, so they'd be kind of almost like sketches just put up. Just a couple more of those. I'll just race through those. One where I combined thinking about sort of historical structures and the meaning of those. So a little painting underneath, if you can see, that's a kind of Victorian promenade with a great exhibition hall painted in as if it's a sort of 19th century painting with this contemporary Eden Project structure laid over the top. Just looking at the sort of historical contemporary meaning of structures. And the last one of this series, which was quite a sort of a bit of a parody of planning in a way, but just kind of exaggerating things into a slightly absurd level. So a kind of a technological looking building that's almost not really there, it's just a collection of light and shadow in a sense, and then kind of a public sculpture which is so big it's the whole sky, and the kind of uniformity of the tower blocks sliding off the surface. And they're kind of deliberately, as you can see, sort of cut out and stuck together. They don't sort of form any kind of like rectangle or square shape. So from that, coming a little bit more up to date, and kind of moving away from images in quite that way, or sort of anything quite so concrete, into structures and environments and spaces that are in between, and between a building and a piece of scaffolding, or between a structure and a pile of something. When does a kind of thinking about when might a pile of tyres or something become a building or become a structure, which we'll see a bit later. So this one was the sort of start of this series of work, really. If you can hopefully see it, the colour's a bit strange. It's called Heritage, and it's 120 by 120, and starts this sort of conversation between a very kind of gestural painting of the sky, which is obviously just, you can see the sort of velocity of the brush marks against the kind of monumental piece of scaffolding from that particular viewpoint, so that you're looking up at it. But really kind of thinking about the building site as a and being quite specific about the scaffolding in terms of the sort of materiality of the scaffolding netting, which is a motif that I sort of use a lot, but unspecific about what's in it. So it's something that could be coming up, going down, it could be a monument, it could be a building. And then the grid, which is a repeated motif throughout, is starting to become sort of detached from the ground and unstable, and almost it's erased, or it's like archaeological and it's not there anymore. Sorry. So that was the first, and then another one in this early late series, called titled Curb Appeal, to use that sort of horrible estate agent phrase, which is again wanting to create a conversation between this very, it's hard to see this one because dark paintings are always really hard to photograph, but between this darkness, dark space with these industrial kind of relics coming out of there. And actually in real life it's very shiny, so deliberately so that you can only see that from certain angles and you have to move around to be able to find the image. And then the very much sort of dissolving spray painted grid that becomes almost like a graffiti tag at the bottom, and a sort of awkward punctuation mark in the middle, which could be like a swimming pool or something, but it doesn't fit, it doesn't really, it's like a dream or something like that. And these kinds of conversations are coming out later. And then onto a one after that, which is about 7 foot long, something like that, this painting called Mai Tai Beach Fizz, like named after one of the paint colours used in it. And here, I mean, actually I have got, oh, hang on, wait an hour to restart. Which the idea of this was to create a very, I mean, complex sounds a bit, but a sort of, yeah, a kind of complex surface with lots of layers of, some of it is like poured paint kind of gesturally thrown onto the canvas, a lot of stenciling in different layers in order to create a very unsolid, sort of diaphanous ground, really, so that you don't know what's come first, and it's not really there, it's kind of ghostly. And I'm really kind of interested in these hybrid structures as well. That's sort of, this one being this weird brick thing being sort of between sculpture and furniture. And it's actually from the Olympic Park, which is a source of quite a lot of inspiration, and they're kind of nonsensical things that you can't, it's too low to sit on, it doesn't really work as anything, but I kind of brought those in, and then the scaffolding becoming more elaborate, so that actually what happens is that what's in the scaffolding becomes less important or even irrelevant, and the scaffolding becomes the subject. I've just got a couple of details in there so that you can kind of see some of the relationships of these kind of areas of surface and depth, and how the grid takes you back to a little excerpt from that Poussin painting at the back there, drawing on this idea of Arcadia, and also taking you back in terms of distance, but taking you back in time as well. So thinking about conversations between historical landscape painting and what a contemporary landscape might be, even though it's a bit like a parallel universe or something. And there's just a sort of detail of the scaffolding. And then on to painting, which is called a little painting, which is called Speculation, and which has a kind of double meaning of something being like a very speculative landscape. As you can see, it's not really fully formed, it's just sketched in, it's very reductive, it's kind of like the least you could do to suggest a landscape with these Victorians who've turned up from a 19th century painting about the Grand Tour, and they're sort of speculating over the landscape. So I was thinking quite specifically about land ownership and things like that. But it also gave me a sort of idea or a direction into this very reductive way of creating a tree or something, and what would be the most reduced way of doing that. And then I started introducing some cartoon elements of really almost like a sort of kid's drawing of a tree, which I'll see in a minute. This next one, okay, yeah. So this is really coming up to date now, and yeah, and sort of asking the questions or creating the dialogues that I want to be sort of asking at the moment. And this is called All That Is Solid ... and is about 150 by 120, so it's medium size. And I really wanted the grid to become detached from perspectival space for once, and really kind of come up to the surface and become this looping and warping thing that doesn't really make any sense and is kind of emblematic. And so what it kind of did to the sort of painting surface and like sort of freed it up in terms of horizontality, and almost the space is kind of vertical space, which is quite different to things that I've done before in a sense. And so it dislocates everything, it sort of destabilizes everything, and there's no solid ground, and everything is unsolid and kind of destabilized. And then I kind of took the structure from, it's actually from a bonfire structure in Lewes, where I live now, but taking it out of context and moving it into the space of painting, hopefully it becomes something that can be read in different ways and is potentially a sort of protest structure or a barricade, especially with the two guys who hopefully suggest this sort of anarchy or menace. And it's a bit tricky to see because it's very soft, the way that the elements interact with each other, but here I started to use the spray paint like almost like I'm defacing something, defacing the painting, so it becomes a bit like graffiti in the bottom right hand corner, but then also as a pictorial thing as well, so it feels a bit more like smoke in the sort of top right hand corner, and then is also the grid, so that there's these different conversations going on between this one particular material. And so another thing about this painting, I suppose, in terms of new directions and stuff, it started me thinking about the Michel Foucault's idea about heterotopias, being this idea of a kind of a space or a event or a kind of scenario that mirrors society but has slightly different sort of rules somehow, and thinking about that and kind of dark folklore and ritual as well. So it's kind of a new layer in terms of the subject. And then more recent work, moving on to these, this is the same kind of size, and using this motif, which is really important at the moment, of tyres and piles of tyres. And it's quite, this whole thing about piles is quite influenced by Philip Guston and the way that he kind of uses these piles of stuff, and you sort of wonder what the meaning of that is. But also as a very sort of visceral material, which you see these kind of different ways that tyres are piled up in scrapyards and things like that, and these weird spaces again, which are a bit like building sites, and they kind of have their own rules. But again, it could be a sort of protest structure or something like that. And bringing in, as I was saying before, these kind of cartoony elements of very rudimentary ideas of what a tree could look like in bright pink, and question about whether something is graffiti or whether it's the kind of road markings that you get done in spray paint as well. And hopefully a conversation as well, again back into sort of historical painting and sort of romantic vignette from the kind of Caspar David Friedrich, of the moonlit space to move into. But you can maybe see, it's hard to see the sort of materiality, but in this detail where I'm wanting to create quite a very sort of haptic, tactile materiality of the tyres with thick oil paint against the melting spray painted grid next to it. Next one, sorry, it's very slow moving. And one following that, which kind of looks at similar concerns, but wanting to create something that is so packed that it's kind of falling out of the painting. It's wanting to burst out of the painting. There's too much in there. this can't really, it's a tricky to see, but trying to create conversations within the painting that everything has a sort of slightly dual interpretation, or creates a dialogue between something that is a paint that forms an illusory thing, but then also acknowledges that it's just paint on the surface as well. So the fire has like a semblance of fire, but also if you see it in real life, you can see that it's just drips of paint. So it's kind of creating an illusion and denying it continually. This is the last sort of painting of this series, called Miami, which is like it's a reworked older painting, which I've never done until recently. I've never returned to anything, but it's quite interesting because the sort of original painting would have the top bit, the kind of the scaffolded building, and something else underneath, and it's almost like I've come and sort of defaced my own painting in a certain way, you can kind of see that, I think. So again, kind of using the idea of graffiti as a kind of emblematic thing of urban space, but also as a sort of suggestion of potential of chaos as well, and also again reiterating that sort of surface of painting, the fiction of it, with these kind of cartoony elements coming in, which, like I said before, it's about reduction of what a kind of landscape element could be, but also they have a different velocity and they move across the surface in a different way. So again, it's a conversation between surface and depth, and this quite kind of considered painting of the scaffolding against the chaos of these overlapping grids, and there's lots of kind of layers on there. And the grids, having become very sort of diaphanous and detached and unstable, quite influenced by Rosalind Krauss's essay on grids, which is really great, where she talks about the duality of that being they're emblematic of architecture, but also in the space of a painting they become kind of detached from reality, like that sort of double meaning. This painting is another sort of 120 by 120. And then to finish really into something that looks a bit different, which was a different kind of project, but it's I'm sort of really interested in expanded painting and site-specific painting, and painting responding to environments. So in terms of my work kind of being about architecture or engaged in dialogues about that, but actually coming off the surface, and then the surface of the painting becoming the actual space, the actual architecture. And this was a project I was invited to do called Bread and Jam, that was in a sort of rundown house. It wasn't derelict exactly, but where we each had a room to respond to. And I had this lovely room with a really sort of nice kind of atmosphere, but it was sort of, the walls were kind of covered in torn wallpaper, and I just, well, see this one for example, there was like an old boiler and a burn mark on the wall, so I kind of intervened with this little classical landscape in there. So I'm just responding to little kind of things going on in the room, like this was a flick of emulsion, and I could turn it into a kind of ideal little landscape, romantic landscape, with watercolour. So with this, as fast as you paint the watercolour onto the lining paper, it kind of fades, so you're sort of chasing it in a sense. There's a kind of real sort of nostalgia and wistfulness about them. And then it's quite interesting in terms of people coming in to see it. That one's actually got a title. It's called Torn Turner, because it's a Turner landscape, little in the lining paper. But when people would come in to see it, some people would come in and not see anything at all and go, "This is rubbish," and leave. And some people would come in and just notice one thing, and then it would reveal, and then they would notice everything else in the room. So the room was empty apart from these things. So it's kind of interesting in terms of expectations of how you see painting. And something I'm, like I say, really interested in. And the next show I'm doing is into Victorian abandoned houses. So invited to kind of respond to those. And they're really derelict, so there's a lot more architecture revealed. So I won't plan anything. I'll just turn up and respond to it in a very sort of site-specific way, but it might be something that is more of an architectural intervention. So that's it. So hopefully got a sense of kind of conversation between painting as an object, painting as an object that exists in space but also has a sort of depthless potential fictional surface as well, and the kind of dialogue between those things. Okay, so I'll stop sharing.
Brilliant, thanks so much. I'm just going to unmute everyone for questions. Do you have any questions? Everyone should be able to unmute and so I've unmuted, but if you just unmute yourself if you're still muted.
Am I muted?
No, I think you're good. I've got a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the process from like start to finish for your paintings, like how you kind of gather the different imagery, or what, I don't know, obviously you've touched on it, but yeah, what is it?
Yeah, sure. So depends what sort of series that I'm working on, I guess. So I might take my own photographs, for example, and I quite like a really rubbish disposable camera that then you sort of get them printed out and they have that kind of glossy surface, and then often might paint on top of those to simplify things or to erase things, and then that might develop into something, or I might sort of plan something out with tracing paper, let's say, and I have like motifs in my head that I kind of put together and rearrange and then work from there. Images that I might find in terms of a sort of particular subject, made up things. So, like for example, the sort of scaffolding motifs in the past been quite located in something real, and I'll exaggerate that, but then now I've come away from that and I just kind of sort of make them up in a sense, having looked at a lot of these things. So they're really kind of impossible and divorced from reality. Yeah, does that answer?
Yeah.
Kind of a process of collecting motifs in a sense and working these things together. Yeah.
And do you think now you've reworked a painting, you're going to start reworking other ones, or was that kind of a one-off there?
I did it with another one, yeah, which was good. It's kind of an interesting thing to return to what you were thinking at the time, and then to work again on that, and almost contradict what you were doing before or something like that. Yeah, so I've got a lot of work to do that with. Yeah.
Do you have any questions from the crowd?
Can I ask like a follow-up question on your question? Like in terms of the media that you use, you sort of mixed media. Like I'm thinking about the grid pictures, because I also know you use a lot of sort of pencil and drawing. So like how do you plan out before like which areas are which, or how you're going to layer it, or is that like a process throughout the work?
Yeah, in terms of the sort of combination of materials and things.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tess, by the way. Lovely to see you. Yeah, I think it's a good question, because they've got kind of very complicated now in terms of the sort of amount of layers and things going on in there. I think I've got like an idea of what what ingredients are going to go into a painting. I think that's it really. So I think, okay, I need this kind of motif in there. I want this particular atmosphere. I want this particular excerpt from another painting, or the feeling of something historical or whatever it is. And I need this, and I need this viewpoint. And so there's sort of ingredients, and then it's sort of intuitively worked on the surface, but in a way it's actually comes from like exploring and sort of quite a lot of different kinds of materials and ways of working over the years that I know what's going to happen if I do this on top of that, and yeah, it's sort of having that different kinds of vocabulary to be able to draw on. But they're very sort of it's very deliberate. Like if there's a gesture that's like that on it, it's not really, it is like that, but I've really thought about that it has to be exactly like that. It's not, yeah. So they're quite, there's a deliberateness about the way that everything's put together.
I have a question.
Hi.
In those congratulations on your work. In those interventions that you do in those houses that are, falling apart almost, these kind of textures, do you stay there till how develops the idea of how do you why do you depict those? Obviously, I have seen that very nicely. You take advantage of the shape of the surface that are falling. So, but are you staying there time enough to get into the feeling of what is needed in, like finding those places where you find that inspiration to make your introduction there of your painting?
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. That's a good question. So with that project, it's quite a relevant question because so I had like a week in there. So I didn't stay there overnight, but it was quite spooky. But I sort of stayed there every day for quite a long time. But I did go in with preconceived ideas. So I thought, right, I'm going to do something about the regeneration of the area, and took these things in and and it just didn't work at all. So, and then I sort of thought, I've got to respond to this particular space and what it's doing and what the atmosphere of this is and what the kind of textures and images that suggest themselves. So it took a while to click into that. Yeah.
Did you have like drawings first or like photographing first what was happening texturally in the surface, so you could complete in a way your
I just if I'm answering your question, if I'm getting what you mean correctly,
sorry, English is my first language. So what I mean is like did you process till you have what you are depicting? Did you make any kind of process in sense of seeing how these surface that are falling apart and they are, the paper is coming out and things like that, so you could adapt better to those realities of the space?
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. No.
No. Wow, that must be that is a challenge, going like blind and just need to feel the flow of them.
And just straight on with the watercolor, knowing that it's not going to last, so it's a temporary thing. I mean, it was a temporary thing anyway, but and just being quite happy with that, and that the next person would come in and do whatever and paint over them. And actually they didn't, they wanted to keep them there, but I mean, they're gone now. But yeah, no, just sort of like it was really, really lovely. It's sort of interesting to me way of working with painting, because it's all, painting is, I always get questions about conservation and things like that, so it's lovely to do something really temporal, really site specific, that is that's not going to last and is experienced for a week or something and then never again. if that does that.
That's very nice. Very poetic in a way as well.
Yeah, it was quite so I can't wait to do it again. I won't do the same thing, but yeah.
I was wondering how much you let the audience into the political nature of your work. Is it with kind of writing alongside, or just through the titles, or when you're talking about the people?
That's a good question, and I mean, probably maybe for, there's so much about sort of. Okay, let me answer that again. So not really with writing, no, because I think I sort of what I want to do is sort of slightly obliquely have these things in there and these potential suggested meanings. Yeah. So for example, I'm obsessed with brutalism and I'm really interested in tower blocks and things like that, but I rarely ever paint them because they're kind of a shortcut to meaning, or they can be. And then you immediately can read something like, oh, that's about modernism, that's about this or that, whereas I think I need to go sideways from that and have something that is might talk about that, but it could be something else. So I kind of want everything to have a sort of a double meaning potentially, and then certainly with the things that are more maybe about regeneration or something. I mean, that's one subject in them, but there's so much about painting as well. My paintings are all about paintings, and the history of painting and sort of all that. But so those kind of works, I'm looking at the sort of absurdity of things and objects and spaces, rather than kind of really being overtly sort of political and saying what I actually think, because there's complicated arguments with all these things. But sometimes the titles do, like the one speculation is quite overt with the title, but other things, I mean, the paintings now are very sort of quite fantastical actually, and definitely don't have like a very particular political statement at all. They're just hopefully full of sort of questions about things.
Thank you. Any last questions? Anyone else? Brilliant. Well, if we could all just unmute our microphones and just give Alison a really big round of applause and say thank you.
Thank you.